Thousands of products move through international trade. Each product has to be classified for purposes of duty calculation, trade statistics, and other agency monitoring. In some cases, international carrier rates are based on the classification. At one time, each country in the world had its own procedure of how to classify products. With the advent of the Harmonized Commodity and Coding System, uniformity of classification was adopted by participating countries. Generally, this uniformity goes to the subheading level, which is the first 6 digits of classification. The U.S. uses Schedule A as the import classification schedule, while exports can be classified under Schedule B. Schedule A, with some exceptions, can be also used for export classification. Both schedules correspond to the worldwide harmonization of product classifications to the subheading level. As the U.S. schedules have more than 6 digits, the other 4 digits reflect sub-sub and statistical classifications. As also shown on this, next to this video, you'll see various links to other websites that may be useful for additional reading. Here's one that is particularly excellent, and it's a free HTS course offered by the USITC. Note the learning modules. And where are the tariff numbers found? All are on the U.S. International Trade Commission website, which goes into detail of each classification to the 8-digit level. How do you classify something? First, you have to collect product information. Resources to obtain product information include the manufacturer, supplier, buyer, importer, reference library, product website. Ultimately, the correct classification must follow the general rules of interpretation, which will be explained in detail in later slides. To narrow down the choices, there are available tools online. Most of these require inputting a keyword which reveals possible classification matches. The U.S. has the free online CROSS system, which posts binding rulings for classification, valuation, and other import facets. If you have a similar product, this can be a great aid to determine the logic Customs and Border Protection used to issue a binding classification ruling. In many cases, the service can be provided to use to narrow down the choices of point the inquirer in the right classification direction. The U.S. International Trade Commission also has an online reference tool. Inputting a keyword or phrase will reveal associated classification possibilities. The downside is that this often reveals too many choices to narrow down. CBP has a program to provide free binding rulings primarily to importers. This is an example of the binding ruling request. No specific format is required, but as much information to aid CBP to make a determination, the better. In lieu of the hard copy version, rulings can now be applied for online. The response can take CBP up to 30 days. Census oversees the Schedule B reporting, primarily used for statistical and license purposes involving exports. They too have a search engine similar to the USITC. This takes the inquirer through different questions about the product to narrow down a likely classification. CBP has written several publications that explain the logic of classifying particular product lines. One of the most complicated areas of classification is apparel. Note there are several publications relating to apparel and textiles. Here's one of the publications, the classification of children's apparel. Note it's 22 pages long. Here are the table of contents. You can see the detail that this goes into. Why is classification so important? For import cargo, the classification is key in determining the duty rate, while the classification of exports doesn't have much financial ramifications. Certainly, the review of proper classification is much more extensively monitored by CBP for imports than by census for exports, as revenue to the government is at stake. This doesn't minimize the need to accurately classify exports for statistical purposes. The next slides go into more detail of these reasons for the importance of classification. CBP uses the concept of reasonable care to evaluate the compliance of importers in following their regulations. Relating to tariff classification matters, these are the reasonable care points CBP is trying to get across to importers. From an importer perspective, note that classifications is among the common customs compliance errors made. From the import perspective, the largest issue of customs bond claims is associated with classification matters. This illustrates the importance of getting the classification correct at the time of entry. For exports, there is no such bond procedure, but failure to provide a correct Schedule B number can likely delay the export approval of an EEI filing. Also, there are possible export compliance issues if grossly unreasonable classifications are chronically reported. This is where the HTS number shows up on the import declaration. The classification is often the basis used by customs to determine if an item is subject to inspection or not. And here's where the HTS shows up on the entry summary, which calculates the duty. Obviously, choosing the wrong classification could result in paying too much duty or duty when the article is free. For the importer that makes an incorrect classification and pays incorrect duty, there are mechanisms to correct the situation. Not as formal, but adjustments to export EEI classification filings can correct the discovery of a misclassification. The import security filing is needed on goods coming into the United States that are about to be shipped overseas. Note the very specific requirement is that classification must be shown at this stage. Pre-clearance planning is essential to ensure whatever classification is provided on the manifest is consistent with what is shown on the customs entry. Product classification is used to compile trade data. In aggregate, the value of the current U.S. trade deficit is calculated, or specific information is available of what was exported from specific U.S. states to regions of the world. The classification schedules A and B are organized in similar fashion. General notes in the beginning, then section notes, Within the section notes there are chapters. At the beginning of each chapter are chapter notes. The Schedule B has about 7,000 classifications, whereas the Schedule A has over 18,000. Most of the differences accounted for in statistical differences, while some chapters in A are not in B. In the Schedule A, which is the HTS US, the general notes define much of the structure of the subsequent tariff sections and chapters. The bulk of the general notes cover how special trade programs work. Here's an actual question taken from a previous customs broker license examination. The answer is found in 2 locations of the tariff. Choices A, B, D, and E do not require a customs entry. The electrical energy is further defined in Chapter 27, Note 6. Just because food is imported for a notable effort doesn't exempt the need to still make entry. Because of the end use, the classification could very well be duty-free. The first 97 chapters of the HTS US fall under sections. For instance, Section 11 is textiles and textile articles. Chapters within that section progress from yarn to fabric to finished textile products. Similar product progressions from raw materials to finished products are evident under other sections. Within the sections are chapters, which also show the actual tariff pages of specific classifications. Here is an excerpt from Chapter 61's notes that defines what products are and are not part of Chapter 61. Here's a page from the HTS US. Note the duty rates are in 3 columns. General, normal trade relations, special, trade programs, and column 2, which are nations that aren't normal trade relations. Notice much higher duty rate for those nations that are not normal trade relations. The Part 2 video continues with the details of the general rules of interpretation.